A few years after the world stopped caring, a single phone call changed everything. A woman identifying herself as COZ, the cousin of Candace Wells, dialed into a late-night live stream and dropped a story that stunned even hardened true crime viewers. She claimed the Wells family was innocent, that Summer wasn't the target, that the abduction was a revenge hit gone wrong after a banned substances bust tied to a man called Spider.
Look up a dude named Spider, okay?
All right.
He was arrested at 2 o'clock in the morning the day Summer went missing.
She named people, gave times, even described where it happened. And when the hosts checked the details, much of what she said seemed to exist, just not when or how she claimed. Is she revealing a buried truth, or concocting the perfect lie?
You can investigate those too. You can, as I speak. you
Okay,
go
I'm gonna
right
look
online
up and see if they have a
Google this.
cousin named Cuz first. That's gonna be
No,
my
listen.
first step.
Look up a dude named Spider, okay?
All right.
He was arrested at 2 o'clock in the morning the day Summer went missing.
Okay.
And he was in a drug deal, okay? He was arrested a few miles down from their house, right in Rogersville, Tennessee. He was meeting three people from Virginia. They were coming up, okay? And somebody called him an anonymous tip, and he was busted.
Uh-huh.
It wasn't the Wells that called him in, but the people they were hanging out with called him in. You can look this up. His name's Steven, and he goes by Spider. June 15th, you look this up. I'm telling you the truth. They bust Spider.
Okay, his
And
name is
people-
Steven though.
Yeah.
And he was arrested
can
June
look it up right now.
15th
Yep.
of last
At 2
year.
o'clock in the morning. No.
2 years ago.
2021.
At the center of the COZ theory lies a single timestamp, 2 o'clock in the morning. According to the caller, that was the moment everything began, the spark that set off the chain reaction, leading to Summer's disappearance. She said a man called Spider was arrested a few miles from a 110 Ben Hill Road, the Wells family home. His real name, she claimed, was Steven. He was caught during a banned substances deal with 3 people from Virginia after someone made an anonymous tip. Her tone was confident, her details precise, and her story fit together so tightly that it sounded almost impossible to question. She told the host that everything tied back to 110 Ben Hill Road, but insisted it wasn't the Wells who made the call that led to the bust. It was the Crawfords, she said. In just a few sentences, she connected banned substances, revenge, and the Wells property into a single line of causation: a banned substances bust at dawn, a kidnapping at dusk, and a tragedy born from mistaken identity. It was simple, dramatic, and felt disturbingly real. But when the claims were checked against public records, the structure immediately collapsed. Local archives from Hawkins County confirm that a man named Stephen Lee, Spider, Blake did exist, and that he was arrested by the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office after an anonymous tip about methamphetamine possession. The arrest time was close, around 2 a.m., but the date wasn't June 15, 2021, the day Summer vanished. It was July 15, 2021, exactly 30 days later. That difference is not a technical error. It destroys the timeline on which COZ built her entire version of events. The arrest did happen in Rogersville, roughly 3 to 4 miles from the Wells home, near Ebbing and Flowing Springs Road off East Main Street. Deputies Zachary England, Scott Stewart, and Reba Matthews reported that Blake was walking on the roadside when they approached him. Acting on a tip, they searched him and found 11 small baggies containing about 7 grams of methamphetamine. He admitted the banned substances were his and was charged with felony possession with intent to deliver. There was no vehicle, no group of 3 people from Virginia, and no mention of any connection to the Wells family. The overlap between what COZ said and what the record shows is limited to 4 points: the man's nickname, the time of arrest, the anonymous tip, and the general proximity to the Wells residence. Everything else, the date, the alleged group from Virginia, the suggestion that the arrest led to immediate retaliation, falls apart under basic scrutiny. When you move the date 30 days forward, the chain of cause and effect no longer holds. COZ's version implies a continuous line: Spider arrested at dawn, news spreading through a banned substances network during the day, and by evening, someone arriving at the wrong home and taking the wrong child. It sounds coherent only if all those events occur within a single 24-hour cycle. The verified record shows something completely different. The Wells case was already national news by July 15. The property had been searched. Law enforcement had public command posts in the area. The idea that a group of banned substances dealers would kidnap a child near the most heavily monitored address in Hawkins County a month later is not logical. The only piece that fits neatly is the time, 2 a.m. That detail made the story feel authentic. It's specific enough to sound like first-hand knowledge, but generic enough that no one could immediately verify it during a live stream. When COZ said, 2 in the morning, it created an image of secrecy, danger, and precision. It felt like something only an insider could know. By the time anyone checked, that detail had already become a permanent fixture in the public imagination. The number survived, the context didn't. The real arrest is mundane. July 15, 2021. A man alone on a road. A call to the sheriff's office from an unknown tipster. No gunfight, no carload from Virginia, no connection to the Wells family. Spider was booked into the Hawkins County Jail, held without bond, and scheduled for a hearing on August 2. The report fits on one page. It's an everyday banned substances arrest in a county overwhelmed by methamphetamine cases. Nothing about it links to a missing child. The 30-day discrepancy is more than a date error. It reverses the order of cause and effect. In the logic of criminal investigation, sequence determines plausibility. If event A causes event B, then A must come before B. In this case, A, the Spider arrest, came after B, the disappearance of Summer Wells. Therefore, it cannot serve as the trigger for retaliation. Once that link breaks, the rest of the story loses its core. The significance of that single date error extends beyond chronology. It reveals how easily a rumor can attach itself to a real event to gain credibility. COZ didn't invent Spider. He's in the records. She didn't invent an arrest at night. That also happened. She only shifted the timeline, turning a July incident into a June one. That adjustment gave her story the illusion of immediacy. It turned a routine banned substances bust into a kidnapping. Why she did it is open to interpretation. She could have misremembered, repeating a rumor that circulated inside her family or community, or she could have deliberately reframed a known event to construct a more convincing narrative, one that exonerated the Wells family and redirected blame toward an outside criminal circle. In either case, the reliability of her information becomes compromised. When one central detail fails, the rest of the testimony must be treated with caution. The COZ call shows how quickly people fill the gaps that official investigations leave open. When the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation remained silent and the case went cold, speculation filled the void. A timeline built on emotion replaced the official one built on evidence. For many viewers, COZ's story offered something the authorities never gave: an explanation. Even if it was wrong, it felt complete. But investigation is not about what feels complete, it's about what survives verification. The Spider arrest survives only in part. The nickname, the time, and the anonymous tip are real. The date, the connection to Ben Hill Road, and the retaliation theory are not. If you remove those false elements, what remains is a lone arrest unrelated to a missing child case. That is not a coincidence, it's a correction. The difference between June 15 and July 15 is the difference between narrative and evidence. One sustains belief, the other demands proof. When those two collide, only one can stand. The arrest record remains public, the timestamps immutable. The story, no matter how vividly told, cannot bend time to match itself. COZ's entire theory begins to disintegrate at that point. Without the timing, there is no motive chain. Without the motive, there is no reason to invoke revenge. And without revenge, the idea of a mistaken identity abduction collapses. What's left is a rumor built on a real name and an imaginary schedule. When the verified date is restored, the revenge narrative disappears, and the COZ theory loses its foundation before it even begins. The first fact checked is the first fact that fails. From that moment on, every subsequent claim must be treated not as truth, but as reconstruction. COZ's story didn't stop at Spider. It widened into a second arc meant to explain motive. The abduction wasn't aimed at the Wells at all, she said. It was aimed at a different family, the Crawfords. The intended victim, according to her, was a girl named Journey, the daughter of Marina Crawford, who, in COZ's telling, floated on the edges of the same banned substances scene that supposedly led to Spider's arrest. The logic was straightforward and seductive. If someone tipped off the police and blew up a deal, the people who lost money would retaliate. If the caller was connected, by address, acquaintances, or rumor, to 110 Ben Hill Road, then a quick, dirty payback could land at the wrong door. A child taken from the wrong family would explain why nothing in the Wells household ever quite fit the pattern of a planned abduction. It turned chaos into a story that closed all the loops. Then COZ added a final turn of the screw. She claimed that a man named Ricky Crawford was killed, drowned, she said, right after the spider incident. In her sequencing, Spider's bust set off a fuse. Ricky's death proved the fuse was lit. Summer's disappearance was the blast. The claim had the shape of a neat triangle, a tipster circle, a dead man, a missing child. The effect on listeners was immediate. The proximity to the Wells gave it relevance. Anyone already suspicious of the Wells timeline felt an alternative click into place. But the moment those names were checked, the seams split. No public record shows a missing child report for a girl named Journey Crawford in Tennessee around June 2021. No Amber Alert. No police summary. No coverage that would accompany even a brief disappearance. If a child named Journey had been threatened, removed, or even rumored to be missing, there should be a trace, an incident log, a family statement, a social media call-out. There isn't one. And the Ricky claim fares worse. A man named Ricky Dale Crawford does appear in local dockets. But he is alive. His file reflects arrests and probation issues, not a drowning, not a homicide, not a death certificate. The proof of retaliation that anchors COZ's theory evaporates on contact with documentation. What remains are fragments that feel true without being verifiable. It is plausible that members of a Crawford family lived rough, bounced through unstable housing, or hovered near homeless camps. Those conditions exist in Hawkins County, and they intersect with substance, probation, and welfare checks. It is plausible that people with the surname Crawford had ties, strong or loose, to the same porous social circles around Ben Hill Road. It is plausible that someone named Marina struggled on those margins. None of that converts plausibility into evidence. COZ took those plausible fragments and fixed them into a frame labeled motive, then asked the audience to supply the screws. The rhetorical method is precise. Start with a concrete name that can be found in a docket, a Ricky. Add a second name that sounds specific but isn't anchored to any public record, a Journeyed. Stitch them to the earlier 2 a.m. arrest so the whole structure reads as a single chain. Each part lends credibility to the others because they appear to corroborate across stories. The problem is that only one part, the existence of people named Crawford in the area, survives external review. The rest relies on repetition and the confidence of the speaker. Even if you grant the possibility that COZ misheard or misspoke, the scale of error is not a typo, it transforms outcomes. Saying a man is dead when he is not changes the category of the claim from perfect memory to false assertion. Saying a child was the real target, when no record of that child's endangerment exists, moves the claim from untested lead to unsupported allegation. In investigative terms, those are hard failures. A lead with no corroboration does not become more reliable because it fits a narrative. A rumor with a name attached does not become a fact because the name is real. There is another practical problem with the mistaken target premise. If the objective was to punish the people who lost Spider, the cleanest retaliation would be directed at the known adults who caused the loss, not at a child. That distinction matters in banned substances world payback. Violence tends to follow debt chains and perceived betrayals, and the message must be legible to those inside the network. Striking a child from a different household introduces risk and ambiguity. Risk because it draws law enforcement heat. Ambiguity because the intended message gets lost in the noise of a high-profile missing child case. In other words, the very act that would allegedly declare power would be the act most likely to destroy the operation that carried it out. Criminals do irrational things, but durable networks avoid self-immolation. What, then, explains the persuasive pull of COZ's account? Specificity and proximity. She spoke as if she knew Journey and Marina personally. She described Ricky's fate with the certainty of a relative delivering bad news. That confidence, broadcast in real time, functions like a credential. It persuades viewers to give her claims a grace period. By the time anyone combs through records, the story has already settled into memory. There was a second family, there was a dead man. The wells were never the point. There is also the emotional economy of the case to consider. The Wells timeline is maddening, the official briefing sparse, the search is inconclusive. Into that vacuum walks a caller who ties Spider to a motive, and the motive to the wrong child. It explains nothing less than everything. In that context, the bar for acceptance lowers. Viewers are not just testing a claim, they are buying relief from ambiguity. The names, Journey, and Ricky, are the price of admission to a simpler story. Even judged on the most generous terms, however, the claim cannot be rehabilitated without evidence. If Journey existed as a targeted child, there should be a complaint, a welfare check, a school report, or a relative's public plea. If Ricky died by drowning in a retaliatory act, there should be a coroner, a case number, or at least a rumor that matches the month and manner across independent sources. Instead, the only constant is COZ's voice. It is strong, but it is alone. This brings the analysis to a consistent pattern across the theory. Where COZ's claims brush against verifiable edges, the edges resist. The Spider arrest exists, but the date breaks the cause and effect. The Crawford family name exists, but the linchpin events, Journey's targeting and Ricky's death, do not. The more the story depends on paper, the less it holds. The more it depends on effect, the stronger it sounds. By the end of the comparison, the mistaken target, pillar stands on air. Without a documented victim, there is no alternative target to support the motive. Without a dead Ricky, there is no proof of a retaliatory arc that escalated beyond rumor. The Wells case remains what it was, a missing child with a murky timeline and a storm of speculation. COZ offered a substitute culprit and a substitute victim to stabilize that storm. The names helped. The facts didn't. What follows is the same conclusion that closed the Spider timeline. The theory does not fail because it lacks imagination. It fails because it lacks verification. If you remove Journey and Ricky from the frame, you remove the motive that justifies the abduction COZ describes. What stays is a powerful narrative device, a way to move suspicion off the Wells and onto a faceless network, but not an evidentiary path. And in the work of reconstructing what happened to a child, the line between those two things is the only one that matters. COZ didn't accuse Candace Wells of harming her daughter. She accused her of lying about the hours leading up to it. Her timeline is a lie, she said. In COZ's account, Candace had left the property that afternoon while her mother, Candace Harrer, slept inside the camper. The three boys were in the house, unsupervised. Summer was outside. Candace wasn't there when it happened. COZ insisted. She went to take Hunter home. That one statement rearranged everything. In Candace's public version, the day was short and ordinary. The family went swimming, came home around 3:30 p.m., planted flowers, and within minutes Summer went inside to play. Around 6:30 p.m., Candace called 911. Between those points, she claimed, only a few minutes had passed. COZ said it was hours. She said Candace left the property, dropped off Hunter, stayed longer than she admitted, and that during that absence, the last moments of Summer Wells unfolded without an adult present. If COZ was right, the missing child case that had consumed the country began long before anyone realized. The 6:30 p.m. call would no longer mark the start of a crisis, but the end of one that had already been running for hours. The timeline collapses into a gap between roughly 4 and 6 p.m., a period when every version of events turns vague. It's in that gap that COZ places the disappearance, not in the few minutes Candace described to reporters. Her accusation wasn't just about the clock, it was about motive. She said Candace lied not to hide a crime, but to protect herself from the state. The Department of Children's Services had already been involved with the family, and COZ claimed Candace feared losing her boys if authorities learned she had left them alone while visiting Hunter. That fear, in her mind, explained everything: the insistence that she was home, the insistence that she had been gone 2 minutes, the insistence that the children were never unsupervised. COZ framed the deception as survival, not guilt. She went further, saying that Allie, Hunter's mother, also lied to protect herself. She already admitted that was a lie, COZ said during the call, referencing an online video in which Ale allegedly changed parts of her statement about seeing Summer in the car. Whether that retraction existed or not, COZ used it as evidence that multiple adults were shaping their stories to match each other. To her, the synchronized testimonies were not proof of innocence, but coordination. The contrast between the two narratives, Candace's short version and COZ's long one, changes everything about how investigators should have searched. In Candace's telling, Summer vanished within minutes of being seen. That implies a fast response could save her. But if she had been missing for hours before the 911 call, then the early search grids, sent tracking dogs, and helicopter sweeps were chasing ghosts. A 2-hour difference isn't an academic argument. It's the difference between pursuit and reconstruction. Candace's defenders argue that trauma scrambles memory, and that a rural mother might easily misjudge the clock on a chaotic day. But her detailed interviews contradict that defense. She didn't hedge, she stated exact times, exact actions, and her sequence never shifted. The rigidity of her version, always the same words, same order, made COZ's accusation of fabrication easier to believe. If Candace truly left the property to take Hunter home, the implications reach beyond negligence. It opens a door for others to have approached the property, for an accident to have occurred unnoticed, or for someone within the household to have had time to clean or conceal. COZ never accused Candace of doing anything violent, but she made it clear that the lie about timing created space that could hold anything. Law enforcement has never publicly confirmed or denied whether Candace left during those hours. They rely on cell phone data, witness statements, and a 911 log that starts at 6:30 p.m. But COZ's statement suggests that even if the data puts Candace's phone near Ben Hill Road, it doesn't mean she was physically present at the house. In rural terrain, a few miles can blur into the same cell tower radius. That technical ambiguity lets both stories live side by side, one built on documents, the other on the voice of someone who sounds sure. The logic of COZ's claim is simple. A mother under pressure lies to avoid losing everything else. Fear of DCS, fear of public judgment, fear of being tied to people under investigation for banned substances. Any of those could make an instinctive lie feel necessary. The irony is that even if that lie was meant to protect her, it did the opposite. By locking herself into a timeline that doesn't hold, Candace became the unreliable narrator of her own crisis. Every inconsistency turned into suspicion. From an investigative point of view, motive doesn't soften the damage. A false timeline, whether born of fear or calculation, still poisons the first hours of any search. Officers deploy resources according to what witnesses tell them. The dogs trace the freshest scent from the place and time a child was last seen. If that starting point is wrong, everything that follows is built on error. The evidence doesn't vanish by magic, it vanishes by direction. That's the silent cost of Candace's possible deception. If Summer disappeared closer to 4 in the afternoon, any trace of her movements, any chance encounter, any camera footage within that window may have expired by the time the call went out. Neighbors who might have noticed a vehicle or a stranger could have already gone to work or home. Every minute after the fact becomes an opportunity lost. COZ's accusation therefore cuts two ways. It doesn't convict Candace of harm, but it indicts her as a poor witness. If the timeline she gave was false, every subsequent search interview and theory built on it is compromised. She may be innocent of violence, yet guilty of confusion. And in the logic of a missing child case, confusion is its own form of obstruction. The most generous reading of her actions is that she lied because she was afraid. The most realistic is that she lied because she thought she could control the story. But stories are not evidence. The phone logs, the drive times, the distance between the Wells home and Hunter's house, all can be measured. The hours that don't fit can't be ignored. By COZ's account, the real story of that afternoon isn't a 2-minute tragedy. It's a 2-hour void. A mother drives away, the house quiets, a child disappears, and by the time panic sets in, the truth has already been edited. Candace may not have harmed her daughter, but by erasing the real timeline, she may have erased the only route back to her. COZ's theory rested on the idea that everything began with a phone call, but not the one she made to a YouTube show. The real call, she said, was the one that turned Spider in. In her version, that tip didn't come from the Wells family at all. It came from the Crawfords. She said it with absolute certainty, cutting through the host's questions before they could finish. It wasn't the Wells who called it in, she repeated. It was the Crawfords. That single claim reshaped the entire motive of her story. If the Wells didn't make the anonymous tip that led to Spider's arrest, then the retaliation that followed wasn't directed at them intentionally. It was aimed at the Crawfords, and Summer became the collateral damage. The problem is that the real police file never says who made the call. The report of Spider's arrest lists the source simply as an anonymous tip. That's the only word it uses. No name, no number, no follow-up line explaining who called or why. In most banned substances investigations, that's where the trail ends. The identity of an informant is protected by policy, not public record. So when COZ claimed to know exactly who made that call, she was stepping beyond what anyone outside law enforcement could legitimately know. This raises the central question: how could she know? There are only two realistic explanations. The first is that she had access to internal or first-hand information, someone connected to the investigation, to the Crawfords, or to Spider himself told her who made the call. The second is that she guessed, piecing together fragments of rumor and assigning blame to make the narrative coherent. Both scenarios are possible, but each carries very different implications. If the first is true, and she did have inside knowledge, then COZ's relationship to the case is much closer than she admitted. Her statements would suggest contact with someone directly involved in the investigation, or with the arrested man himself. That level of detail, knowing the identity of a supposed anonymous tipster, doesn't come from gossip. It comes from someone who has either read restricted paperwork or spoken to participants. Yet COZ never explained how she came to know. She only said, repeatedly, "We've already turned all of this over to TBI," implying that she and unnamed relatives had been in communication with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation about their findings. If that was true, her insistence that nobody was listening to them becomes harder to dismiss as performance. It sounds like frustration from someone who believed she'd given real information to authorities and had been ignored. But the second scenario, guesswork, is equally plausible. Within small communities, especially those affected by banned substances, rumors about who called the cops travel faster than the truth. Every arrest generates speculation about betrayal. Someone always points a finger. It's an ecosystem where trust and paranoia coexist, and gossip becomes currency. In that world, saying, "The Crawfords called it in," doesn't require proof. It only requires a motive and a target. The Wells had already been painted as suspicious. Shifting the blame to another family restored some dignity to them, while giving the audience a new villain. It's narrative balance disguised as insider knowledge. To test which version holds more weight, it helps to look at what was publicly available at the time of her call. The arrest record for Stephen Lee, Spider Blake, was a matter of public record, but it didn't include the name of the tipster. The only confirmed details were the location, the time, and the fact that the tip existed. No media outlet published the source. No follow-up interview or police statement elaborated on it. That means anyone who claimed to know who called would either have to be speculating or referencing information not contained in open files. COZ spoke as if she were reading from a closed report. Her language was exact. It wasn't the Wells. It was the Crawfords. No hesitation, no, "I think," or "I heard." That tone, the certainty of someone used to stating facts, made her story convincing even when the data didn't back it up. She anchored her claim to a moral argument. The Wells were being destroyed publicly for something they didn't do, while the real culprits hid behind anonymity. It appealed to the audience's sense of injustice and framed her as a whistleblower, not a gossip. Yet, when you compare her confidence to what can actually be known, the gap is obvious. The Hawkins County Sheriff's Office had no public reason to share the identity of a confidential tipster with anyone, much less a distant relative of a family adjacent to the case. The TBI, if they were involved, would be bound by the same confidentiality. That leaves only a narrow path for how she could possess such knowledge: a personal connection to Spider, or the Crawfords that allowed her to hear it firsthand. But even then, that information would be hearsay, not confirmation. Her repeated reference to "way" is also telling. Throughout the call, she said, "We have turned this into TBI. We've been trying to get them to listen. We've sent proof." The plural suggests a small internal group, perhaps relatives, perhaps community members, who had gathered material on their own. If they genuinely submitted evidence, it would explain her anger at being ignored. But it also suggests a common dynamic in high-profile cases: civilians constructing parallel investigations, convinced that official silence means conspiracy. The credibility of her statement depends on how far you think an ordinary citizen can reach into a live investigation. In Tennessee, tip lines and arrest logs are heavily filtered before release. Even local journalists have to file requests to access basic reports. For COZ to identify a specific family as the anonymous source would require information not available through those channels. That doesn't automatically mean she lied, but it means her knowledge either came from someone directly involved or from a process of elimination shaped by rumor. If she did guess, her choice of scapegoat wasn't accidental. Naming the Crawfords served multiple functions. It shifted suspicion away from the Wells, who were under intense public scrutiny. It tied the story to existing banned substances-related rumors, adding realism. And it reinforced her own reliability. She wasn't defending the Wells blindly, she said. She was exposing the real people responsible for triggering the chain of events. In that framing, calling out the Crawfords became proof of her courage, not recklessness. Still, the fact remains that her claim exceeded what any public record could support. The Spider file lists the tip as anonymous, full stop. Law enforcement confirmed nothing more. Until a named individual or an unsealed affidavit surfaces, the sentence, "It was the Crawfords," is an assertion without evidence. And in investigative work, the line between what is known and what is claimed matters more than the conviction behind it. By the end of her call, she had built herself into the story's moral center, the one person willing to say what others wouldn't. But the evidence she offered stops where public access ends. Beyond that line, everything depends on belief, her belief in her sources, and the audience's belief in her. The record remains silent. When COZ said, "It came back to 110 Ben Hill Road," she wasn't talking about geography. She meant the chain of blame, the invisible thread that connected Spider's arrest to the house on the hill where Summer Wells lived. In her version, the Wells weren't criminals. They were victims of proximity, caught in the fallout of a world that revolved around banned substances, debt, and mistrust. But that one sentence, "It came back to 110 Ben Hill Road," also contradicted everything she was trying to prove. If the trouble came back there, it meant the house wasn't as isolated from the chaos as she claimed. The Wells home sits in a steep, wooded hollow in rural Hawkins County. Anyone who's seen footage from news crews knows the setting: a gravel driveway curling up through trees, an old single-wide, a few broken-down vehicles, stray items scattered through the yard. That isolation worked both ways. It protected privacy, and it hid neglect. Over the years, local social services had been to the property more than once. Neighbors described noise, fights, strange visitors. Dawn Wells admitted to substance. Candace was rumored to have ties to people in the local banned substances scene. None of that proves direct involvement in criminal activity, but it paints a picture of a household far from clean. In the video discussion that followed COZ's call, the hosts on Dolly Vision repeated that quote, "It came back to 110 Ben Hill," as if it were a map coordinate. They used it to show how every path in this story, legal or illegal, eventually circled back to the same address. What COZ meant as exoneration became evidence of entanglement. To insist that the house was the target of revenge is also to admit that the people there were connected enough to be seen as players in that network. You don't mistake a random home for the center of a banned substances feud unless that home sits inside the orbit. That contradiction sits at the core of the case. COZ called the Wells innocent, but described their world in terms that make innocence impossible. If the property was a place where users or dealers drifted in and out, where tips about Spider could have been made or overheard, then it functioned as part of the same ecosystem she said was responsible for the abduction. The Wells didn't need to sell banned substances or handle money to be connected. They just needed to live inside the exchange, where everyone knows everyone, and silence is a form of survival. There are degrees of complicity. The first is ignorance, not knowing what passes through your yard or your friends. The second is tolerance, knowing and looking away because confrontation is dangerous. The third is participation, taking small roles in the cycle, driving someone, passing a message, trading favors. COZ never placed the Wells in that third category, but her own statements imply the second. She said they were innocent yet surrounded by people who weren't, and that one of those people likely triggered the revenge that took Summer. If true, that makes 110 Ben Hill less a crime scene than a reference point, a node in a network that law enforcement never fully mapped. The environment mattered as much as the people. The house was overgrown, isolated, and poorly maintained. It offered the kind of privacy that both criminals and addicts use as currency. Social workers later described conditions inside as unsafe for children. Even if the Wells were not dealing, they were living in a context where dealing happened nearby. Every car that came up that road, every person who knew how to find that address, expanded the risk. COZ wanted the audience to see that the Wells were victims of that world. What she accidentally revealed is that they were also part of it, at least by geography and by silence. That silence is the most consistent feature of the entire case. The Wells said little publicly after the first months, retreating behind statements of faith and frustration. The neighbors said less, fearing retaliation or judgment. Within that vacuum, 110 Ben Hill became both symbol and scapegoat, proof that the family's suffering could be traced back to an environment they couldn't escape, but also never fully rejected. From an investigative standpoint, no address exists in a vacuum. A property associated with repeated welfare checks, substance use, and transient visitors cannot be described as uninvolved. COZ may have been right that the Wells didn't make the call that led to Spider's arrest, but her own words tie them to the world where that call mattered. It came back to 110 Ben Hill is not exoneration, it's a map of risk. The tragedy of the Wells family is that their home functioned as both shield and signal. It sheltered their children from the outside world while broadcasting to that same world that they were within reach. Whether or not anyone inside dealt banned substances, the property was part of the circuit, the kind of place where information moves, where tips are traded, and where retaliation can find a face. COZ wanted to prove the family's innocence, but by making 110 Ben Hill the central landmark of her theory, she placed them exactly where every path converges. In trying to clear their name, she confirmed their proximity to everything they wanted to deny. The house was not the crime, it was the coordinates. And in a county where lines between victim and participant blur by the day, that distinction changes little. When COZ spoke about a man on Rowan Mountain posting strange things on Facebook, the livestream chat froze. Her tone shifted from factual to fearful. He says, "Steal their kids and homeschool them," she told the host. He runs something called Isaiah House. They say they're Amish, but they're not. They take kids and nobody ever sees them again. For a few seconds, the audience didn't breathe. The idea that there could be a hidden compound in the hills, religious, secretive, stealing children, fit perfectly into the dark legend that had already formed around the Summer Wells case. COZ's claim combined three elements that true crime audiences react to instantly: religion, isolation, and missing children. The phrase, "was steal their kids and homeschool them," sounded like a confession. The mention of, say, a house, gave it a name. And Rowan Mountain gave it a place, a rural, heavily wooded area with just enough obscurity to sound believable. The more she spoke, the more it felt like revelation. But when investigators and online researchers looked for confirmation, there was none. No registered organization called, say, a house, operated anywhere near Rowan Mountain. No formal religious community resembling the Amish existed there. No police reports, welfare checks, or missing child leads pointed to a compound, or a private school. The only trace anyone found was a line from a personal Facebook account, long deleted, quoting a passage from the book of Isaiah about reclaiming God's lost children. The original post was likely spiritual, not criminal. Somewhere between a verse and a screenshot, the message had mutated into a confession of abduction. That shift, from scripture to suspicion, is what made the story powerful. In communities where trauma and fear run deep, a line like, "We steal their kids and homeschool them," doesn't read as metaphor, it reads as evidence. The religious language of salvation becomes indistinguishable from the language of kidnapping. When COZ repeated the quote, she stripped it of its biblical context and dropped it into a narrative already charged with paranoia. Suddenly, a Facebook status was no longer a verse. It was proof that children were being taken and re-educated in the mountains. The error wasn't random. It followed a predictable psychological pattern. Audiences interpret information through the lens of what they already fear. After weeks of speculation about banned substances networks, secret retaliation, and corrupt law enforcement, COZ's reference to an Saya house was like adding a missing puzzle piece. It made the invisible visible. A religious compound became a perfect hiding place for a child who had disappeared without a trace. The more impossible it sounded, the more convincing it became, because it explained the unexplained. In reality, the words homeschool and Zaya are common markers in faith-based online communities. Thousands of posts include both terms without any sinister meaning. The Amish Mennonite and evangelical groups in rural Tennessee and Virginia often describe their family education that way. To someone unfamiliar with that culture, the language can sound coded, even threatening. To someone looking for signs of trafficking or child concealment, it sounds like confession. COZ took that misunderstanding and gave it certainty. No local investigation ever confirmed the existence of a child camp or Isaiah house connected to the Wells case. No witnesses saw unregistered vehicles heading into Rowan Mountain. No aerial searches revealed isolated structures. And no missing child files were linked to the region. The entire claim traces back to a screenshot, a small digital artifact pulled out of its religious frame and inserted into a crime story. What happened next followed the usual rhythm of viral fear. Viewers clipped COZ's quote, reposted it, and built threads on social media asking if the Zaya house was real. Within hours, images of random rural homes and barns were circulating under captions like, "Is this the place?" Livestream hosts debated whether the Facebook status was code for trafficking. By the next day, the story had mutated beyond COZ's control. On message boards, users referred to the Amish connection as fact. Others expanded it into a network that stretched across multiple missing child cases. The line, "We steal their kids and homeschool them," became detached from both the Wells case and its original source, a floating piece of text used to validate any claim about hidden religious abductions. That is how misinformation behaves. It doesn't need intention, only repetition. A single out-of-context sentence can generate an ecosystem of fear. Each person who reposts it adds conviction, and conviction looks like proof. By the time corrections appear, they seem like cover-ups. COZ probably didn't invent the quote maliciously. She may have seen it online, misunderstood it, and repeated it in good faith. But by the time she said it live, she had given it new meaning. The audience didn't hear scripture, they heard confession. And once heard that way, no amount of fact-checking could return it to its original form. The Zaya house story illustrates exactly how a narrative mutates when faith language meets true crime suspicion. Homeschool becomes imprisonment, God's children becomes someone else's children, and the Bible becomes a code book. It's a pattern that turns metaphor into evidence, and evidence into myth. By the end of the livestream cycle, the Rowan Mountain compound had joined the list of unsolved threads that orbit the Wells case, no basis in record, but impossible to kill. COZ's entire theory depends on a straight line, a chain of cause and effect so neat it almost feels scripted. It begins, in her words, at 2 a.m. with Spider's arrest. From there, the sequence unfolds like a domino row. A tip betrays Spider. The betrayed seek revenge. They target the Crawfords. They mistake Summer for the wrong child. And Candace lies to hide what really happened. The logic is circular but emotionally complete. Every question about motive, opportunity, and silence finds its answer inside that loop. It's a structure that doesn't ask for evidence. It asks for belief. The problem is that every link in the chain depends on one central anchor, the timing of Spider's arrest. Move that anchor even a little, and the rest collapses. In COZ's version, the sequence happens within a single 24-hour cycle: Spider arrested at dawn, revenge forming by morning, the abduction by dusk, and a family scrambling to cover a truth they can't say out loud. But when the official records are placed beside that story, the dates refuse to line up. Spider's arrest was not June 15, the day Summer disappeared. It was July 15, a full month later. That difference destroys the continuity. There can be no retaliation for a bust that hasn't yet occurred. The second link, the 3 people from Virginia, fails for the same reason. COZ described them as the outsiders who came to meet Spider for a banned substances deal, a carload that arrived in Tennessee and vanished once the bust happened. It's the kind of cinematic detail that adds credibility to a story: unknown men, out-of-state plates, a fleeting connection to the scene. But the police report lists no such group. Spider was arrested alone, on foot, carrying methamphetamine, not driving a vehicle. There were no other arrests, no warrants, and no mention of Virginia. The entire element exists only in COZ's version. The third link, Journey as the real target and Ricky's supposed death, fails under verification. No missing child named Journey Crawford ever appeared in state records. No homicide or drowning investigation ever listed a Ricky Crawford. Both names exist in the county, but not in the way COZ described them. The people are real, the events are not. When the chain is checked point by point, each hinge that should lock COZ to effect slides loose. Her entire causal map looks like this. Spider's 2 a.m. arrest leads to anger. Anger leads to retaliation. Retaliation hits the wrong family. The wrong child is taken. The family lies about timing to hide fear. In narrative terms, it's perfect. It explains the unexplainable and distributes blame in a way that feels fair. The Wells are victims, not villains. The Crawfords are punished, not innocent. The banned substances world is cruel but logical. It's a tragedy with structure. That structure is what keeps people believing it. Facts complicate stories, but stories survive by rhythm. The missing link, the false timestamp, turns the rhythm into noise. If Spider's arrest happens a month later, there's no revenge to plan. If there's no revenge, there's no reason for anyone to confuse 2 families. And without that confusion, the entire premise of a mistaken abduction falls apart. The moment that MPC GI, the false date, is exposed, every other piece that depends on it loses weight. The chain doesn't end, it never starts. Still, the emotional coherence of COZ's story is what keeps it alive. The pattern she offered, crime, retaliation, mistake, cover-up, is one of the oldest in human storytelling. It's the same rhythm as a folk tale or cautionary myth. Each act answers the previous one, and by the end, the audience feels a sense of moral closure. That's why the factual inconsistencies haven't killed the theory. People believe it not because the data works, but because the sequence makes emotional sense. The Spider arrest gives her story its opening act, the betrayal gives it conflict, the abduction gives it tragedy, and Candace's lie gives it mystery. Remove one, and the others lose their function. She built a logic model, not a timeline, if this, then that. The beauty of that design is that it sounds like evidence even when it isn't. Every broken link can be dismissed as a misunderstanding instead of a contradiction. Maybe the date was wrong, she might say. Maybe the records were delayed. The chain holds because it's flexible. It's designed to survive correction. Yet the power of the chain remains psychological. To people desperate for a motive that explains why a 5-year-old vanished without a trace, COZ's structure offers certainty. It says, something happened, someone caused it, someone lied about it. It replaces chaos with sequence. Even after each detail is disproven, the feeling that the sequence should be true lingers. The mind resists randomness, and COZ gave it order. Her story survives for the same reason conspiracy theories do. It sounds like it could happen, even if it didn't. The banned substances bust, the revenge, the mistaken child, the lie to social services. Each piece reflects real behaviors in similar cases. The overlap between plausibility and falsity is where her theory thrives. By the time you reach the end of her chain, the evidence no longer matters. What matters is the sensation of closure, the sense that the world makes sense again, that one event leads to another in a way that feels human. COZ's narrative achieves that perfectly. It satisfies emotion while defying documentation. The chain she built doesn't reveal what happened to Summer Wells. It reveals how quickly a human mind, desperate for reason, can forge meaning from coincidence. By the end of 2025, the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had received more than 6,500 tips connected to the disappearance of Summer Wells. The number alone was staggering, a volume large enough to fill an entire case management database. Yet, despite 4 years of searching, interviewing, and following leads, there were still no arrests, no suspects, and no official breakthroughs. Each tip was logged, evaluated, and either pursued or archived, but none had led to a conclusion. In that silence, a different kind of truth took root, the kind that grows when official answers don't arrive fast enough. Throughout the life of the investigation, TBI maintained a single public position. The case remained active and ongoing. Every few months, they released brief statements reminding the public that Summer was still missing and that credible information could be submitted through the official tip line. What those updates never included were names, theories, or clarifications about rumors. There was no acknowledgement of Spider, no mention of a family called the Crawfords, no reference to a girl named Journey, and no rebuttal of the mistaken identity narrative that had spread online. For people who followed the case daily, the agency's silence began to sound like avoidance. Inside law enforcement, that silence is procedure. Investigators avoid addressing every circulating theory because doing so risks confirming details that should remain confidential. The moment an agency begins denying one rumor, it signals which ones are close to the truth. It also invites endless escalation, each clarification breeding 2 new questions. For detectives who must preserve evidence, protect witnesses, and maintain the integrity of a case file, selective communication is the only defense. But to an anxious public, selective communication reads as concealment. The logic gap between those 2 perceptions became one of the defining dynamics of the Wells case. From an operational standpoint, TBI's silence was caution. From the public's standpoint, it was confession. Every month without a statement became proof that the agency was hiding something, proof that they knew more than they were saying, proof that perhaps COZ was right. When officials say nothing, rumor sounds like revelation. In the early months of the case, that gap was manageable. The public expected investigators to protect the process. But as time passed and tips accumulated with no visible result, patience eroded. Journalists who once quoted official statements shifted toward interviewing YouTube hosts and local residents. Independent investigators began filing Freedom of Information requests that came back redacted or denied. TBI's internal policy toward missing child investigations reinforces this problem. Cases with potential criminal elements are sealed by default. Even when tips are debunked, the agency rarely announces it publicly, choosing instead to keep the focus on the child's safe recovery. But after years of silence, the absence of updates becomes its own signal. It tells the public the Bureau has nothing new or worse, something it doesn't want to share. Neither interpretation helps. TBI officials, bound by confidentiality, watch from a distance as public discourse mutates around their silence. Their position remains unchanged. If they speak too much, they jeopardize the case. If they speak too little, they lose control of it. Every statement they release must survive both court scrutiny and media misinterpretation. So they stay quiet, waiting for a verifiable lead, while the outside world narrates the void. That void has power. It is the space where independent creators like Dolly Vision, Voices Behind the Wall, and Justice for All thrive. The lack of closure keeps audiences engaged and theories profitable. Each new video promising answers fills the silence left by the Bureau. In that sense, TBI's communication strategy, while logical inside a law enforcement framework, feeds the very speculation it seeks to avoid. The silence becomes content. For the Summer Wells case, that ecosystem took root faster than anyone predicted. Each time TBI declined to comment, someone else filled the gap with certainty. When asked about Spider's alleged connection, officials said nothing. When pressed about the Crawfords or a girl named Journey, they said nothing. To viewers already convinced by COZ, that silence wasn't neutrality, it was confirmation. The phrase, "no comment," mutated into, "they can't deny it." Immediate dynamics amplified the effect. Local reporters, constrained by ethics, could only quote official sources, which meant repeating the same neutral lines. Independent channels faced no such limits. They could say what others wouldn't, ask what others couldn't, and speculate without legal consequence. That difference made them appear braver, even authoritative. Over time, viewers shifted their trust away from the institutions tasked with finding Summer and toward the voices that promised to reveal what those institutions supposedly hid. From a communications perspective, TBI faced an impossible equation: speak openly and risk compromising evidence, stay silent and risk losing the narrative. They chose the latter, and the consequence was a full transfer of credibility, from state investigators to online commentators. Even if TBI were to issue a comprehensive statement tomorrow, half the audience would read it as damage control. Once suspicion replaces patience, transparency no longer heals it. Still, there are reasons their silence makes sense. The agency's mandate is not to entertain theories, it's to preserve cases that might one day go to court. Every public denial could later be introduced as testimony. Every confirmation could tip off a suspect. The Bureau's restraint may be frustrating, but it's also strategic. The investigation cannot bend to match the rhythms of the internet. Its responsibility is to the evidence, not the audience. That perception is what COZ's story exploited so effectively. Her voice filled the vacuum left by the state. She offered names, motives, and emotions, everything the official investigation couldn't. The public didn't choose rumor over law enforcement out of ignorance. They chose it because it spoke. In a world where communication equals credibility, whoever talks longest wins. By late 2025, the Wells case had become less about what happened to Summer and more about who controlled the narrative of her disappearance. TBI held the evidence, the internet held the story. Between them stretched a silence that neither side could bridge. For every 6,500 tips logged, there were 100 times as many theories circulating online. The Bureau's quiet professionalism could not compete with the internet's loud conviction. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation may one day release the full record of what they found, but until then, the absence of information remains the most powerful evidence of all. In that vacuum, every theory, no matter how implausible, can breathe. And as long as that silence continues, the line between fact and faith will remain blurred, echoing across every screen where the case is still playing. COZ's story ends the same way it began, with a voice trying to make sense of silence. Over time, her call hardened into a theory, a framework that seemed to explain everything the official investigation could not. It connected Spider's arrest, a tip from the Crawfords, a revenge plot, a mistaken child, a dead man, a religious cult, and a mother's lie. Each piece sounded plausible on its own. Together, they formed an almost perfect chain of cause and effect. To many, it felt less like rumor and more like revelation. But when the claims are laid beside documented facts, the entire structure bends under its own weight. COZ made 8 central assertions. First, that a man called Spider was arrested at 2 a.m. on June 15, 2021, only hours before Summer Wells disappeared. Second, that the arrest happened during a banned substances deal with 3 men from Virginia. Third, that someone connected to 110 Ben Hill Road made the anonymous tip that led to Spider's capture. Fourth, that the Crawfords, specifically Marina and her daughter Journey, were the true targets of the retaliation that followed. Fifth, that Ricky Crawford was killed or drowned shortly after, his death proof that the revenge was real. Sixth, that the whole sequence pointed back to Ben Hill Road, proving the Wells were victims, not perpetrators. Seventh, that a Facebook post by a man on Rowan Mountain reading, "We steal their kids and homeschool them," exposed a secret compound called Isaiah House where abducted children were hidden. And finally, that Candace Wells had lied about her timeline, leaving her daughter alone between 4 and 6 p.m. and calling 911 hours too late. The appeal of these claims came from their order, not their accuracy. They filled every gap in the official record with a cause, every silence with a motive, but when matched against verified data, only fragments hold. Spider Blake was indeed arrested, and it did happen around 2 a.m., just not on June 15. The arrest took place on July 15, a full month later. The police report lists no other participants, no vehicle, and no reference to Virginia. It mentions an anonymous tip but never links it to any family or address. The geography aligns. Spider was picked up a few miles from the Wells home, but geography alone does not establish connection. From there, the chain weakens quickly. There is no record of any missing child named Journey Crawford in Tennessee, no evidence of a girl fitting that description, no complaint filed by anyone named Marina. Ricky Crawford, the supposed murder victim, is alive. No death certificate, obituary, or coroner's report exists. The line about, "We steal their kids and homeschool them," comes from a now deleted Facebook post quoting scripture from the book of Isaiah. There is no registered organization called Isaiah House in Rowan Mountain, no evidence of an Amish or religious compound, and no law enforcement mention of one. The claim about Candace's timeline remains unproven. Her statements are inconsistent, but no document confirms that she left the property for hours. The facts are sparse but clear. Spider's arrest was real. The anonymous tip was real. The Wells property existed near known banned substances activity. Everything else dissolves when tested. The rest of COZ's story is a framework built on what investigators call proximity bias, the belief that physical closeness implies causal connection. Because Spider was arrested near Ben Hill, and because Summer disappeared nearby, COZ assumed they were linked. That assumption became her foundation, and every new name or rumor she encountered was fitted into that structure. Yet it would be wrong to treat her story as a deliberate lie. There's a difference between fabrication and interpretation. COZ wasn't inventing details to mislead. She was arranging fragments of real life, arrests, addiction, poverty, rumor, into a pattern that made sense to her. The Wells case unfolded in a community saturated with banned substances and distrust, where police rarely explained themselves and gossip filled the gaps. In that environment, truth doesn't spread, narrative does. Her theory gave a voice to people who felt ignored by the system. It turned helplessness into participation. Still, from an investigative perspective, her story fails the basic tests of verification. The chronology doesn't hold. The sources are not independent. The claims lack corroboration. The details change from one retelling to the next. In law enforcement work, those four pillars, time, independence, corroboration, and consistency, are non-negotiable. Without them, a story remains conjecture, no matter how convincing. What keeps the COZ theory alive isn't its accuracy but its structure. It mirrors the shape of every satisfying mystery, crime, betrayal, revenge, mistake, cover-up. It offers an emotional resolution that the official investigation never delivered. Even when disproven, it feels true because it restores moral order. The Wells family becomes a victim, not a suspect. The community's guilt becomes externalized. It wasn't neglect, it was a vendetta. A story that reassigns blame this neatly rarely dies. Inside that larger myth, however, lies a kernel of authenticity. There really was a man called Spider. There really was a tip. There really were banned substances, poverty, and silence in the hills of Hawkins County. Those are the roots of her story, the pieces that give it credibility. The rest, the Virginia car, the revenge, the drowned man, the cult, is the canopy that grew from those roots, shaded by imagination. The kernel of truth is what keeps the canopy alive. Without that small factual core, the rumor would have withered years ago. The Wells investigation itself unintentionally nourished this growth. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation's limited communication, its refusal to address speculation, and its insistence on secrecy left the public desperate for explanations. Into that vacuum stepped voices like COZ's, offering closure disguised as evidence. When the audience compared her detailed story with the state's minimal updates, they chose the one that spoke to them. In the age of digital storytelling, communication is credibility. The official investigation stayed silent, COZ did not. Evaluated fairly, her account lands somewhere between folklore and witness statement. It is not reliable as evidence, but it is valuable as documentation of how communities process uncertainty. The COZ theory, functions as both symptom and symbol, a symptom of institutional silence, and a symbol of human need to connect random events into reason. Its mistakes reveal how easily a single real event, a banned substances arrest, can become the skeleton of an entire parallel narrative. By the standards of journalism or law, the theory doesn't meet the minimum threshold. There's no verified timeline, no independent witnesses, no official documents, and no physical evidence. But measured by emotional truth, it resonates. It gives voice to rural distrust of law enforcement, to the fatigue of watching years of unanswered questions, to the fear that evil hides in plain sight. Those emotions are genuine, even if the events are not. The deeper truth is that both COZ and her listeners were searching for the same thing the investigators were: coherence. They wanted a version of the story that explained how an ordinary afternoon could end with a vanished child. COZ's theory offered that coherence. It didn't matter that the framework was wrong, it mattered that it filled the silence. When all the pieces are stripped to their essentials, what remains is a small but solid nucleus of fact surrounded by layers of conjecture. A man named Spider was arrested near the Wells home. A tip was made by someone who remains unidentified. The Wells family lived in a region where banned substances and distrust intertwined. Beyond that, nothing in the record supports the web of connections COZ described. The framework is false, but the conditions that made it believable are real. That's the paradox at the heart of this case. The COZ theory fails as investigation but succeeds as illustration. It shows how truth fragments in the space between evidence and emotion, how one fact can anchor 1,000 speculations, and how the search for meaning can eclipse the search for proof. There is, buried within her story, a real fear, a real pain, and a real reflection of a community that feels unseen. In that sense, the theory contains truth. It just points in the wrong direction. COZ's call didn't uncover the secret of what happened to Summer Wells. It uncovered the human instinct to build structure where there is none, to find a pattern inside chaos. Her version may never hold up in a courtroom, but it endures in conversation because it satisfies a need the official investigation still hasn't met. Somewhere between fact and faith, the story keeps breathing, half rumor, half memorial, and its echo lingers long after the evidence runs out.